Welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over server-side pagination using tables. So by server-side pagination, we're just talking about binding our table to an event that queries an external data source for the table's data. All right. I'm currently in the app builder. We have a table based on a previous video. If you haven't watched it, it's the static pagination video for tables, where we basically created this table. We went over the basic pagination terminology and all the minor details. We currently have a table here that is connected to some static data. For me to just jump into my app data, we have a field called user list. It's an array of user data that we copied and pasted from our random data API service. As you can see, I just queried for 45 records. I copied it and I pasted it into our application and represented it using this user interface. So what we're going to do here is we're going to change this to a scenario where we are using server-side pagination. All right. So we're going to fake this just a little bit. So I am going to go back into my table. I'm going to go into the table configuration, into the attributes. All right. So there are a few fields that we need to pay closer attention to. Currently, we are using pagination, but server-side pagination is set to false. To use server-side pagination, we're going to have to turn this on. We have a total data row count that is currently set to 0 by default. Whenever we use server-side pagination, your queries need to basically return a total count so that the system will know how to configure the pagination. All right. And we have a third one, which is our table pagination metadata field. I'm just going to go ahead and change this to something that makes more sense to us. We're just going to call this user table pagination metadata. All right. So I believe that that just makes more sense. All right. So we're going to go ahead and save this. I'm just going to jump back into my app data. So what we're going to try and do here is that we're going to just go ahead and delete all the data that we have in our application. And we are going to change the data source, right, to get this data from an external source dynamically, hence server side, right, using a server or, an external data source. So I'm going to just Control A, delete all of this, and initialize our user list with an empty array. All right. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And you know what? Let me just add one more field here. I'm going to call this user list total count. All right. And this is going to be initialized to 0. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and save. And we are going to, I keep on saving, but I always have one extra thing I want to add. But you know what? Let's just go ahead and refresh the page. All right, so we've refreshed our page. We have an empty table because when we look into our live data, we have no data in our user list, and our user list total count is 0. All right, so this is the total count of our rows or the data sets. So I'm just going to go into my table and just make sure that it's pointed to the appropriate field. So we have a field here called total data row count that houses the value of the total data row count. I'm just going to set this to the app data field. So I'm just going to say parameter dot app underscore data dot user list total count. All right. So this is going to tell our system what the total number of records, right, that our query has resolved. And it's going to use it along with the display limits, right, to calculate the number of pages required in our pagination. And we also have a field here called user table pagination metadata. All right. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to turn this on. We're going to turn our server-side pagination on. Okay. And it gives us some more options, scroll pagination. We're not going to be using some scroll pagination. We're going to do that in a separate video. So because we're using server-side pagination, we need to then use the event called table data fetch. When we were dealing with the list element, it was called list data fetch. These two things work the same way. All right, so what this does here is that it basically runs a function, whatever function that you provided. It's going to run that function, and it's going to run the function whenever the page loads to pull in the initial data, or whenever the table loads, rather, to pull in the initial data, based on whatever filters or whatever logic that you pass into it. It's also going to trigger whenever you change any of the pagination properties. For example, if you were to filter, or sort, if you were to change the page, if you were to change the page index, if you were to change the display size. So what happens is that whenever you do any of these actions, the first thing to happen is that the pagination metadata is going to be updated. And when this is updated, the list or the table data fetch event is going to trigger. Now, ideally, you want to pass that parameter into your function and then run whatever query that you need to run and then display some data. But we are going to use the random data API, and I'm just going to change this here to a size of 10. Okay. And you see, it basically returns 10 records. All right. But we are not going to copy and paste it. We're just going to use the URL, right? So I'm going to go into my function builder. We're going to create a function. We're going to call this function get table user data. All right. We're just going to put a comment here that says demo function for table server side pagination. All right. To create this function, we're going to give our function one workflow. We're just going to call the workflow logic. And within that workflow, we're just going to add one step, or maybe a couple of steps. The first step, which is the most important step, is going to be the network request. All right, so it's going to be a get request. We're going to call this user data. All right. And we are going to be making that request to our random data API. I'm just going to paste it in here. So this is a get request. So, we have all that metadata for our pagination. We're not going to really use it in this context, but in your queries, you could use it to basically affect your queries and show relevant data. But here we're only going to be showing random data, right? So in the next step, we're going to basically update our app data. So we're going to use a function called update client app data. We're going to set two fields. So remember that we need to also set the total counts, right? And here we're just going to hard code a number, right? But in your case, you need to set it to the total count of whatever your query resolved to, all right? So here we are basically, we use a field called user list total count. We could use the no code, or we could use code. I'm just going to switch to code because I've been using no code this whole time. All right, so just going to bracket up and say user list total count. We're going to set that to 100. Like I said, we're just going to hard code this for now. And then we are going to set our user list field to this variable here, user data. All right, so I'm going to set user list to variable, all caps, dot user data. All right, I'm going to go ahead and save this and deploy this function. Now that it's deployed, I'm going to attach that function to my fetch, my table data fetch event. So what's it called? Get table user data. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. So when I refresh my page, or whenever this table loads, as you can see, that function is triggering and it's basically going and it's pulling in the random data, right? That function is triggering, it's calling that random data API, right? Let me do that one more time. As you can see, our random user data, right, is triggering. We're getting the 10 records. And you notice that we have 10 pages, right? And this is because if we look into our table, we have display limit of 10, right? And we've hard coded this user list total counts. We hard coded it in our function to 100. So 10 by 100 is 10 pages. If we go into our app data, we can see, or we can verify that our user list total count is 100. All right. So that's, pretty straightforward. We have a user table pagination metadata field, and let's find it. Just scroll to find it. Should be somewhere here. Perfect. So we called it user table pagination metadata. As you can see, it has all the metadata for our table, the page size, which is 10, the limit, which is 10, the skip, which is 0, the page index is 1, and the sort. All right. So let's just do some cool stuff. So like I said earlier, the table data fetch is going to trigger based on a few events, right? It's going to trigger whenever any of the pagination widgets get changed, right? So if I change the display limits, if I go to a different page, if I change the current page index, or if I click on the column header, right? It's going to add a sort to our metadata, and then it's going to trigger the data fetch. And also one final thing is that we also have a field here called data fetch trigger value. So if you wanted to, let's say, programmatically trigger a refresh, then you would basically use this field to programmatically do this, right? So whenever this changes, right, our table pretty much is going to refresh. Now, you obviously want to bind this to some data in just to a field, right, in the app data, and then update the app data, and then it changes dynamically as you desire. All right, so let's keep a good thing rolling. So let's go to page 2. All right, now we've gone to page 2. If we open up the live app data and we scroll down, we looked at what the pagination state is. As you can see, it's changed, right? We are now in page index 2. We're skipping 10. We still have a limit of 10, and we have a page size of 10, right? And this limit is, based off the page size. Okay. All right. So let's do something else. Let's add some sorting here. Let's click on column header 1. All right. And let's go back into our application data. As you can see, it has, ascending, right? So the sort ID, let's do that again. Descending. All right, perfect. So there you have it. We've basically just gone over server-side pagination with our random data API service as our data source. We've touched all the concepts that we need to know. And that's it for this video. See you in the next one.